I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things, a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that nuclear power's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. No nukes! Good morning, Toledo, and good afternoon, Columbus, and hello to everyone in Bowling Green or listening on the internet, wherever or whenever you may be. You have tuned into For a Green Future. For a Green Future is a show about ecology and the environment. And this show talks about those subjects and the ways that they affect you, your wealth, your health, and your happiness, as well as the wealth and health and happiness of your friends and family and co-workers, and the bears and the deer and the yeast, and pretty much everybody and everything, because we are all wrapped up together on this statistically unlikely piece of rock called Earth. We have another excellent show lined up for you today. This show is the Memorial Day weekend show, and so we'll chat about that for a little bit. Then we have an interview with Stephany Seay with Roam Free Nation, because a critical deadline is coming up for the Yellowstone bison. At the bottom of the hour, we'll hear from our generous patrons and sponsors. After that, we'll hear from Rebecca Wood, and Rebecca will be talking to us about merganser ducks, which sounds interesting. Then it's ecological news, and of course, we always ask people listening to the live broadcast to call in at 877-909-1007. This actually is a recording. Most of this program will be recorded because the station lost the first quarter of the show, unfortunately. So for the first quarter of the show, you'll be hearing this recorded version, and then we'll have the interview with Stephany, and then the show will switch over to Shehbaz Khan and Rebecca Wood, because they were the hosts during the live recorded show. But just for this first part, you'll just be hearing from me. So this was recorded on Memorial Day weekend, a time when we remember our fallen soldiers. Originally, this was a holiday aimed at healing the wounds from the Civil War. There's actually a great deal of debate over exactly where and when Memorial Day or Decoration Day actually began in the United States. One of the first places was Columbus, Mississippi. In April 1866, a group of women who had gone to put flowers on the graves of Confederate soldiers saw that the Union soldier graves were neglected, and so they put flowers on their graves as well. This is why the holiday is also called Decoration Day. Waterloo, New York, though, is credited with being the official start of Memorial Day. In May of 1866, the city closed businesses and held ceremonies honoring their Civil War soldiers. After World War I, the holiday was expanded to include soldiers from all wars, but it didn't become an official holiday set on the last Monday in May until 1971. What the Civil War soldiers fought for, And in fact, what all soldiers have always fought for is land, parts of the earth, territory. The idea of ruining the land to hurt one's enemies is an ancient one. Burning the fields, that is, destroying crops, is a strategy that has been used for thousands of years. There is also the myth of salting the fields, pouring salt on land to make it unable to grow crops. That apparently is a myth, although continuous use of irrigation in dry areas does cause salt to build up in the soil, eventually rendering the ground unable to support life. It's possible early farmers, seeing this process happen but not understanding it, could have blamed it on their enemies. But in our time, it is possible to salt the land, that is, make it uninhabitable, through nuclear pollution. Japan and Ukraine all have already done this to themselves in the areas around Fukushima and Chernobyl. Areas where depleted munitions have been used, such as in Iraq, have extremely high rates of cancer and birth defects, and arguably should be abandoned. Of course, if we actually fight a nuclear war with dirty weapons, the entire planet could be poisoned with radiation. The Civil War soldiers, buried in so many cemeteries around the country, could never have imagined a future where radioactive contamination is possible. However, that is the situation in the Ukraine right this minute. The Ukrainian Minister of Defense has made a public statement that he believes Russia is going to fake a nuclear plant meltdown in order to stall Ukraine's long-awaited counteroffensive. This claim is not credible for the simple reason that nuclear plant meltdowns release radiation into the air that can be measured. U.S. spy satellites constantly monitor the whole Earth for radiation, looking for the signature of nuclear weapons. Any pretend meltdown would be instantly recognized as phony. It seems much more likely that Ukraine is trying to plant the idea of a fake meltdown because they anticipate there may be a very real accident when they try to retake the nuclear plant at Zaporizhzhia. But Memorial Day is a time to look back and honor past sacrifices, not look ahead to possible future disasters. The world was a very different place back in 1866 when Memorial Day started. There were only 1.25 billion people on the planet as opposed to the 8 billion we have today. There were big cities choked with heavy levels of pollution from burning coal, but there were also huge areas that were in a beautiful natural state. There were still great herds of bison roaming the plains, although they were in the process of being exterminated. That process wouldn't reach its conclusion for another 20 years. Sailing ships were still the dominant form of crossing the oceans. Whaling was in steep decline from its peak just 10 years earlier, as the whale populations had begun to crash. Petroleum, coal, and gas were just beginning to be exploited as energy sources. In fact, half the CO2 put into the air at that time by burning fossil fuels is still in the atmosphere today, still contributing to global warming that we're facing now. There were still great flocks of passenger pigeons, although people had noticed they were beginning to decline. The last great colony of passenger pigeons, almost 8 million birds, would be wiped out in Petoskey, Michigan, 12 years later. So in the spring and fall, the sky were still darkened for days with migrating birds all over North America. In any rural area, you could still hear wolves howling at night and find bears roaming in the woods. Great cities dumped sewage and other pollution such as chemicals from tanneries directly into local lakes and streams, but you could still find rivers and streams that weren't contaminated and were still clean enough to drink from directly. Although the cities were lit by flickering lamps burning whale oil, petroleum, or natural gas, for most of the country, artificial lighting did not exist, and all anyone had to do was step outside their homes at night to see the full splendor of the Milky Way and all the thousands of stars that are invisible to most of us today. It was a very different land that the Civil War soldiers died fighting for, but all the processes that have led us to our nearly sterile country were in place and picking up steam. One has to wonder what the soldiers of that day would think of the world that grew from that time. Thankfully, the right side won the Civil War. It's terrible to think of what would have happened if the South had succeeded in creating a racially based nation. But right now, there are threats to our democracy that so many have fought and died to preserve. In August, we will be asked to vote on Issue 1, that is, a constitutional amendment that would change the requirement for creating a citizen referendum. It would increase the number of votes needed for a referendum to pass from 50% plus 1 to 60%. It also makes it more difficult to get the necessary petition signatures to put a referendum on the ballot in the first place. Majority rule, the most fundamental aspect of democracy, would effectively be eliminated. What Issue 1 would do, if it were passed, is give 40% of the voters in the state, a minority, veto power, that is, control over the other 60%. All our soldiers for the past 100 years have fought for some very basic democratic principles like one person, one vote. We are already living in a heavily gerrymandered state, rigged so that a minority party can keep control of the state and do what it wants. That violates those principles that our soldiers fought for. The fact that there will be a referendum in August is a perfect example of that. Republican state representatives and senators, just a few months ago, voted to eliminate the August referendum. They argued that it was just too expensive and there was never enough turnout in August to justify it. However, just a few months later, they decided they needed one, so they reversed themselves. This is the kind of arbitrary, capricious behavior you get when you have one-party rule. The Republicans believe that their supermajority is untouchable because of the gerrymandering they've created, so they are literally doing whatever they want. So those of us who are alive today are faced with the question of how best to remember our fallen soldiers. We here at For a Green Future have always believed that the best way to honor them is to use the democratic rights that they have secured for us. Democracy and environmentalism have always gone hand in hand. Richard Nixon both ended the Vietnam War and created the Environmental Protection Agency because of huge upwellings of public sentiment. People wanted peace, and they wanted their environment protected. They were tired of dead lakes and rivers that caught fire, like the Cuyahoga River did in Cleveland. Because of democracy that our soldiers had secured and protected, the will of the people was then reflected in laws that were being passed. Today, the story is very different, unfortunately, because we see over and over again in poll after poll that Americans want something done about global warming. They want there to be more wind turbines. They want there to be more solar panels. They believe in global warming. And they want us to get off of fossil fuels. They want us to end the whole fossil fuel dependency. Unfortunately, what's happening is that the state of Ohio, anyway, is going in precisely the opposite direction. Increasingly, town councils are voting to ban wind and solar power in towns all over Ohio and in counties all over Ohio. The will of the people used to be courted by both political parties. Then what happened is that the Republican Party learned that they could get more donations, they could get bigger corporate sponsorship by opposing environmental laws and proposing the elimination of environmental regulations. And so they went full force in that direction. Unfortunately, what has happened since then is that money has basically outweighed democracy in many cases. There was the decision of Citizens United, which said that corporations were allowed the freedoms that the Civil War soldiers fought and died for. I think most Civil War soldiers if you asked them if they were fighting to preserve the rights of corporations to participate in the political process, they would have said no. And in fact, back then, corporations weren't barely a thing. People really didn't think about corporations as being entities. That decision that corporations are based on, basically like humans in terms of rights, that didn't happen for another 50 years or so. But I also think it's fairly easy to believe, and I believe absolutely, that all our other soldiers that have died in the succeeding wars, the Korea, Vietnam, Spanish American, none of them, if you had asked them, are you dying, are you willing to sacrifice so that giant corporations can have political rights? I think once again, the answer would have been no. And I think that the courts have basically insulted the memory of those fallen soldiers who were fighting for the rights of humans, they're fighting for the rights of people, their countrymen, other citizens, and instead have arbitrarily handed those rights to soulless corporations which do not care about the country. The corporations that have only the profit motive, that's the only reason they exist, is to make profit. And the quote-unquote services corporation provides to us in that process, those are secondary. Corporations often will just switch what it is they do, what it is they make, in pursuing the greatest amount of profits. And so on this Memorial Day, we have to remember that those soldiers died for us human beings, in order to protect our rights and not the corporations. In fact, what we need to do to honor the memory of those fallen soldiers is to take those rights away from corporations. They don't belong to the corporations. Corporations did not fight and die in our wars. Corporations have not done what is necessary to create a free and open society. And we know this because corporations can exist perfectly happily in societies without democracy. There's tremendous corporations in China, for example, and in Russia, and in 100 other totalitarian states around the globe. Corporations are doing just fine, because they can actually thrive in an environment where there's no limitations on what they could do to the ecology, to the natural world, and an economic environment that allows them to destroy the physical environment in order to make more profit. That goes hand in hand with a lack of democracy, because often, in fact, I would argue always, in the places where the destruction of the environment has been blocked, where the environment has been preserved, it's through democratic exercises of people's rights. It's when people get together and decide, we are not going to let this river get destroyed, or we are going to preserve this forest and we're going to stop the companies that want to cut it down. The expression of democracy is a healthy environment. What we get when we let corporations get involved in the democratic process, the quote-unquote democratic process, is a betrayal of democracy. And unfortunately, we have to report that there is a move right now in Delaware, the state of Delaware, to allow corporations to vote directly in local elections. Our friends over at Common Cause are raising the alarm about this, but the proposal is that if there's a company located has its legal address in a local area in the state of Delaware, then the owners of that company, regardless of whether they live in Delaware or not, And regardless of how many there are, they all get votes in local elections. And so you could very easily have situations where you've got a small town and there's a corporation with a couple hundred shareholders located in that town, and everything that goes on in that town can be decided by the owners, the out-of-town owners of that corporation. And I think most of our veterans, most of our soldiers would agree that that is a betrayal of the democratic principles that they have defended. Because for one thing, those owners get as many votes as they have companies located in Delaware. So if they own 15 companies, that one owner will get 15 votes in local elections. This is being watched very closely because if they get away with it in Delaware, it will probably be proposed all over the country. And we can't let that happen, not if we want to continue to preserve our environment, because the only way we preserve our environment is by letting people make the decisions about what's going to happen to that environment. Because we always say here on For a Green Future, a healthy environment is the infrastructure of freedom. But now all our freedoms are being challenged. Another freedom we hold dear in America is the freedom to assemble, the right to protest. Increasingly, we see limitations on when, where, and how people can assemble to protest unjust policies. Back in the 1800s, when Memorial Day began, protests were routinely what we would consider riots today. They had mob violence, and the army and police were regularly called on to end them using deadly force. Thankfully, we have progressed beyond that, and protests today, for the most part in this country, are peaceful. But increasingly, just the act of protesting has been changed into a felony. Just for holding a protest sign and standing in front of a bulldozer that would destroy more of our natural world to put in an oil pipeline or other infrastructure for the fossil fuel industry, people can now be put into prison for decades. The luxuries we enjoy today would have been almost unimaginable to the soldiers of the 1860s. Fighting in the Civil War. It would be another 50 years before indoor plumbing was even a thing. Every house had an outhouse in the back. There wasn't electricity. The houses were kept warm in the winter by burning coal or wood. But if you went back to the people of that time and asked them, would you give up democracy for indoor plumbing? Would you give up the freedom of assembly for the ability to drive around at 70 miles per hour in a car? The answer would have been a resounding no, because they understood that the basic freedoms were more important than physical comforts. They were willing to sacrifice to protect those freedoms, with many giving the ultimate sacrifice, whose graves we will be decorating on Memorial Day. One thing that we understand better than they did was just how much our society depends on having a healthy environment. People in the 1860s had an idea of a bountiful nature that was inexhaustible. They were still shooting hundreds of thousands of passenger pigeons every day. Bison were still roaming the plains, despite the millions that had already been slaughtered. The story of the dodo had been known for 100 years, but the lesson that humans could cause the extinction of an entire species had not yet sunk into Western society. The idea that even the most common and abundant species, like passenger pigeons and bison, could be driven to extinction simply by hunting them was unbelievable to most people. They also could not have believed or even conceived of the fact that the very air they breathed was being supplied by microscopic phytoplankton in the oceans, and that those tiny algae were the base of the entire ocean ecosystem. The gigantic whales that they hunted in their sailing ships were dependent on tiny krill, which ate the zooplankton that ate the phytoplankton. The idea that human society could be totally dependent on the health of plants and animals that supported that society had long been understood by many native cultures around the world. But telling a Civil War soldier that his life depended on algae or the health of the rainforests half a globe away, probably would have been met with laughter. But it is true that those who fight for protecting the natural world also fight to protect our country. On this Memorial Day, we here at For a Green Future would also like to ask you to remember the environmental martyrs around the world who are being murdered right now for the simple crime of trying to protect that world and preserve it for future generations. From Homero Gomez in Mexico, who was murdered for trying to save the winter habitat for the monarch butterflies, to the tribal leaders assassinated in Brazil protecting the Amazon rainforest, people are trying to preserve the natural world. As we have reported before, and has been documented by the organization Global Witness, hundreds of people are killed each year trying to preserve our fragile ecosystems. In a very real way, they are dying for you, because you benefit from having a functioning ecology, and you would be hurt if the world's ecosystems collapse. So as you remember our fallen soldiers, please send up a prayer for those who are fighting for you today, not just our soldiers in uniform around the world, but the activists who are trying to keep that world alive. One of the people fighting to protect the natural world that we have been privileged to get to know is Stephany Seay from Roam Free Nation. There is one herd of wild buffalo still left in the United States, one tiny echo of the vast herds that once filled the continent. She and others are trying to protect that last herd and even free it from being trapped only in Yellowstone National Park. There's an important deadline coming up where you can help free the buffalo. We'll let Stephany tell you about it, and let's go to the interview now.
Sure. My name's Stephany Seay, and I'm the co-founder of Roam Free Nation. We're a wild bison and wild nature advocacy group. Our main focus is on the Yellowstone herds of the Yellowstone country, and we also aid our allies who are working on other campaigns as needed.
Stephany, thank you, and we would like to thank you for your long-time relationship with our show, For a Green Future.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's great to be on again.
You are very, very welcome. It really feels like we have been through a saga together. Of course, recently that saga has taken a turn for the worse for the Yellowstone bisons. Could you quickly please recap what happened this winter and tell us what is the situation now? Has the slaughter stopped?
Yeah, so this winter at an IBM, the Interagency Bison Management Plan meeting in early December, they usually come up with a quota for the number of buffalo that they want to kill through capture for slaughter or remove from the population through capture for quarantine or kill through hunting. This year they did not come up with a number. There was no set quota. And we were surprised by it getting a very intense, very early, and very severe winter, which lasted a really long time. And because of that winter, buffalo as grazing animals, there was so much snow that they came down into lower elevation habitat where the grass is more available, more exposed. And that migration route brings them across the north boundary of Yellowstone into the Gardner Basin. And when they cross out of the Gardner Basin, they enter the state of Montana. And there are, state and tribal hunts that take place there. And the hunters went wild. There was no limit to the killing that took place. More than 25% of the herd was killed or otherwise removed from the population this year. And the winter was so severe that, winter kill, normally about 1 out of every 9 bison succumb to winter kill. And this year was so intense that we're fairly certain that there was far more than that. So we lost over 1,600 buffalo through mismanagement practices alone, specifically the tribal hunts, which killed over 1,100. And it was a massacre. And I was there a few times to see what was taking place on the ground. And there's a place called Beatty Gulch, which is a pretty infamous place. It's just outside the north boundary of Yellowstone. And a lot of the killing takes place there. And it's also known as the killing fields because of how many buffalo die there. And there was gut piles, like everywhere you turned, there were gut piles from hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of buffalo, many of them pregnant females. And so there were also little calves left in their mother's gut piles. And it was just a horrible thing to see. And the hunting, it was a killing frenzy. It was nuts. And it lasted into April. And calving season starts in April. But the buffalo, as a migratory species, tend to move back towards, at least the buffalo that were in the Gardner Basin, they move back in towards Yellowstone National Park. And there's two herds. There's the central herd, and then there's the northern herd. And the northern herd will move back up into the Blacktail Plateau of Yellowstone, where their calving grounds are. And the central herd will start to head towards the west end of the park into the Hebgen Basin. And there are very few. This time of year in the Hebgen Basin, we should be seeing, 400 to 600 buffalo out there. And there reports from the field, from the people who live there, there's not very many. There's a few small family groups here and there. The calves are being born, and, thank goodness for that. But we're really not going to know the impact to both of these herds until Yellowstone National Park does their summer population estimate. But with the numbers that we're seeing in the Hebgen Basin, the central herd really they all got hammered, but the central herd is also the most imperiled because they migrate into both the Hebgen Basin and the Gardner Basin, so they're doubly impacted by mismanagement tactics. And I just got word today from a friend who lives out on Horse Butte, which is some of the central herd's favorite calving grounds, that there are still some hunters around. So it's not over yet. The mass killing is over, but there are still people out looking to hunt buffalo.
The hunting is still going on. That is saddening. And
yeah.
It is unbelievable that we have come so far towards restoring the bison population to a reasonable number on the Yellowstone landscape, and then be knocked back so far in one season. How do you respond to that?
It seems to be the way of the West. It's when an animal is, these buffalo aren't listed yet, but we'll talk a little bit about that. But it just seems to be the way of the West that when an animal is driven almost to extinction, and then, humans try to make the effort to help them rebound, they get to a certain point where they're almost there, and then the killers want to come and kill them all again. It's the same thing that's happening with our wolves. They're trying to do it with grizzly bears as well. And, it's terrible. It's a very human-centric, selfish way to exist on this earth. It's not coexistence. It's very dangerous because if with the Yellowstone population, if any one disaster happened there, maybe a disease or maybe a volcano, Yellowstone is an active volcano, they're gone. That's it. There's no more of the last wild buffalo. And so it's very dangerous to keep them bottled up and to kill them so wantonly like that. It's just been such a terrible season for them. The worst since 2008, which was the worst since the 19th century.
Okay, so the reason we asked you to come to this show this week is that there are some very important deadlines coming up very quickly. Could you please tell us about them?
Yes, the most important one that I really wanted to talk about is the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service is considering Endangered Species Act protection for the Yellowstone buffalo, and there's a comment period that is open until June 4th. And so the public, people who care, have an opportunity to write comments to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service in support of listing these buffalo under the Endangered Species Act. You can go to our website, roamfreenation.org, and right there, the first thing you'll see is a take action that gives you the background, gives you talking points and contact information on to send your comments. And we encourage everyone within the sound of my voice to please take action and request Endangered Species Act listing for these buffalo. Because if they don't get this, not much is going to change. Because it's very clear that the people who are currently managing, the state, federal, and tribal governments who are currently managing these buffalo are doing a really horrible job.
Mm-hmm. So If someone has never made a public comment before, could you please walk them through it? How exactly does one make a public comment?
It's really not that difficult. I mean, and like I said, we offer talking points, and people can use whatever information from our website that they feel they want to. But it's important to speak from the heart. Speak about what you know, and just be as thorough as you can, and cite any facts that you feel would bolster your comments. But it's really a simple thing of individual comments are the most heard. So take our language and make it your own, and just like I said, speak from the heart and represent the buffalo, represent their perspective, and you'll be listened to.
So something on the effectiveness of this comment. Do you think that these comments would help? Will they make a difference in how the buffaloes are treated?
Yes, they will make a difference in how the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service decides to list them or not under the Endangered Species Act. And we need the Fish and Wildlife Service to list them.
Okay. The New York Times recently did a story romanticizing the buffalo slaughter that happened this winter. Could you give us your reaction on that?
Yeah, that was a terrible article. And it wasn't just the New York Times, but the Washington Post, and also most recently the Huffington Post came out with similar articles, which just glorifies what we see as a slaughter. It's not a hunt. I mean, entire family groups getting gunned down in the span of minutes. Hunters shooting at running buffalo, blowing off jaws, blowing off legs, killing pregnant females, leaving calves rotting in their mother's gut piles. I think that the New York Times and the Washington Post and Huffington Post, none of them considered the perspective of the buffalo, the status of the buffalo, or the ecological impacts that these hunts have. It's all a very human-centric dialogue that's taking place. And so we will be responding to that. And it was really disheartening because, and at the same time, there's other tribal members that have come out in recent media saying, we also have treaty rights to hunt there, but we refuse to participate in it because it is a slaughter. And so we need more voices like that raising up. And in fact, our other co-founder, Jaden Medicine Elk, recently wrote and had published an open letter to tribal members participating in the Yellowstone hunt, saying, hey, look at things from the buffalo's perspective. This is not okay. This is not, our ancestors would not be pleased. And you can find that on our Facebook page. It got picked up by the Native News Online and Counterpunch, Montana Current, and the Daily Montanan, and it's really powerful. And I would encourage anyone to visit us on our Facebook page, just Roam Free Nation, and check that out. So that was one response to those other big media articles.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So how can people connect with Roam Free Nation?
You can go to roamfreenation.org, visit our website, and we also have an email list, which is you can find at the bottom of every page on our website. Sign up for that because we'll send you periodic updates. And please like and follow us on Facebook, Roam Free Nation, and share our organization with other people so more people know that we exist. And of course, we're always welcome monetary donations to help keep us getting back to Yellowstone and representing the buffalo. We're about to head back to Gardner just in a couple of weeks for the next interagency bison management plan meeting, and that's going to be a pretty big deal. And we're hopeful that there's going to be a TV crew from CBS there, as well as a TV crew from a French TV station who are going to do some interviews with us and help tell this story. But it's going to be heated, I have no doubt, because nobody is happy with the way that this season went. And even Yellowstone ended up capturing over 800 buffalo that they held in the trap. They did not send them to slaughter, but they held them so that they would not move further north into the hunt zone. So they were equally worried. I mean, it was just a terrible, terrible year.
So this needs a collective effort. Of course, we all need to get along on this. So go on the website, on Facebook, social media, search Roam Free Nation. Before we close, Stephany, one question I would like to ask is, has the federal or state government set up any kind of threshold limits in order to protect the species that are being hunted down in the Yellowstone landscape? Can you?
No, they didn't. And that's part of the problem. That's why we saw such a terrible, terrible season this year. Is because they did it. These buffalo have zero protections. They're our national mammal. They're sacred to so many buffalo culture, plains tribes, and they have zero protections. And all the buffalo people see on the land across the states, those are game farmed. They have been reduced to livestock. They're not the wild species. You only find them in Yellowstone National Park. And we've got to do everything we can to protect them and protect their habitat and protect their right to roam.
Stephany, is there anything you would like to add before we end this interview?
No, I would just really, really encourage people to go to our website and please submit comments to the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. The buffalo have to gain this protection. They have to gain federal protection, or there's going to be more of the same year after year. It's because the state of Montana has a very low tolerance for them, because they view them as direct competitors for grass with cattle, and it's a big cattle state. And so they're trying to control the population. And so they've sued Yellowstone decades ago. The Interagency Bison Management Plan was formed, which basically serves the livestock industry. It does not serve the last wild buffalo. And so they've come up with all these mismanagement tactics to control the population. But, you're looking at an animal that's supposed to exist in the tens of millions across the nation. And now we've got barely 5,000 living on one green dot in the southwest corner of Montana and Wyoming.
That's a huge difference. Thank you very much, Stephany.
Thank you so much.
I will be going on Roam Free Nation and posting my comment today.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
Welcome back, listeners. Just as we are grateful for the work Stephany is doing, we are also very grateful for our advertisers and patrons. Let's hear from our advertisers now.
For a Green Future is also brought to you by the Wood County Park District. The Wood County Park District is a natural resources conservation agency. They protect natural spaces, maintain quality green spaces, provide engaging programming, and they teach people to love and respect nature. They also restore wildlife habitats and lead people on outdoor adventures. Wood County Parks protects natural spaces in Wood County for all to enjoy from 8 a.m. to 30 minutes past sunset every day of the year. There are several ways to get a hold of them and find out what's happening. One is to call them at 419-353-1897. Another is to visit their website, www.wcparks.org. The website again is www.wcparks.org. They are also available on all social media, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and many others. Just search for WC Parks. That's the Wood County Park District, and we're very grateful for their support.
And we're very grateful for your listenership, too. And just a quick note here, just wanted to remind everyone that if you have any kind of comments or suggestions for what we could do with this show, you can email them to joe@DeMare for a greenfuture.org. That's JOEDEMARE FOR agreenfuture.org. And you can call or text anytime at 419-973-5841. We really value your feedback, and we use and act on that right away. And we've been getting signs that more and more people are listening. And so we just wanted to take a moment to say thank you very much for that. And we're going to keep doing this show just as long as we possibly can. Thank you.
Thank you, dear patrons and advertisers. Now it's time for Rebecca to take the center stage. Rebecca, it's all your show now.
Alrighty. So, for my short segment this week, my uncle recently went on another canoe trip in Massachusetts and/or Vermont. I don't know where did this in the Deerfield River. It turns out, and one of the things he sent me a list of critters he saw. One of them was something called a merganser, which I intrigued me because I had no idea what it was. I think maybe I thought it was some kind of bird, but which turned out to be right. So, but yeah, it turns out mergansers, which I also did not know how to pronounce it, but luckily somebody explained it, are fish-eating ducks, it turns out, from the subfamily Anatinae and the family Anatidae, which is just the duck family. They're in the genus Mergus, which has 6 species: the New Zealand merganser, the common, the Chatham, the Brazilian, the red-breasted, and the scaly-sided, out of which the New Zealand and the Chatham mergansers are extinct, and the scaly-side, which is in China, is endangered. The ones that are in North America, have a range in North America, are the common and red-breasted mergansers, meaning that's probably the kind that my uncle saw. And out of all of these, only the common merganser, I believe, the red-breasted merganser is the only one you actually see out in the ocean, and it was on a river, so I'm guessing it was most probably a common merganser, although we do not really know. The hooded and smew mergansers are not, they're called mergansers, they have some merganser-like characteristics, they're not in the same genus. So, but they're out there. The Anatinae subfamily are sea ducks, but most mergansers, although they are technically sea ducks because they're in that subfamily, prefer riverine habitats. So they're misnamed sea ducks, I guess. Plumage tends to be black, white, brown, and green. They have shaggy crests and serrated beaks, except for golden eyes, which eat mollusks, so they do not need the serrated beaks. They got regular duck beaks. They are diving ducks because they submerge completely to feed, and their name comes. Their mergus. The word mergus is turns out Latin for some kind of water bird.
And I've also seen on many National Geographic and other Animal Planet kind of another planets like TV shows. So on those, I've also seen like birds diving into the water,
Right.
grab, to hunt fish. Yeah,
Usually you
that's
can see their little tail, their little butt sticking up in the air when they go down to eat something. It's funny. It's kind of cute. So yes, that's mergansers. I don't know. I have some more in the Deerfield River if we run short on time.
So, thank you very much, as always, Rebecca. It was great and interesting. Moving on to bring you some ecological news around the world. So, I'll quickly run you through some interesting ecological news. Solar panels in Ukraine. A May 20 story in Washington Post titled "Ukraine Found an Unlikely Tool to Resist Russia." Solar panels. Yep, solar panels to resist Russia. Advocates for wind and solar power have long argued that distributed generation, that is having decentralized power based on small wind and solar installations on individual houses and buildings, is much more secure than having big centralized power plants like nuclear or coal generation. Unhappily, that theory is being tested by fire in Ukraine. What is happening in Ukraine is solar panels are being installed on critical infrastructure like drinking water pumping stations, water pumping stations and hospitals, so that even when the grid goes down, they can keep functioning. The Ukraine has also been installing more wind turbines. These efforts have been so successful that the Ukraine has again begun exporting electricity to its neighbors. It is much more difficult for weapons like cruise missiles to take out a wind farm, which has dozens of turbines spread out over square miles of land, than a coal plant which has one central building that can be easily targeted by bombs.
Hadn't thought of that.
Similarly, sending missiles which cost millions of dollars to destroy every single solar roof installation, which only costs thousands, is a losing proposition. A solar installation occupied with battery storage can keep the lights on in a town totally cut off from the national grid.
Wow.
They become independent. Increasingly, that's exactly what's happening. Renewable energy is helping the Ukrainians resist dictatorship. Moving on to the next news. TCE causes Parkinson's disease. Excuse me. One way our veterans have suffered during their service has been routine exposure to hazardous chemicals. A May 23 story in Smithsonian Magazine details a study that definitively links trichloroethylene (TCE) to Parkinson's. Drinking water at Camp Lejeune in North Carolina was contaminated with TCE. Please excuse me if I am pronouncing Camp Lejeune incorrectly.
I think that's right. I know people who've actually been there. If it's a training camp, it's like the training camp that, what is it, the Marine? Everybody from the Marines starts out there? Yeah.
Yeah, it's a Marine training camp.
My roommate was there, so I think you're saying it right.
Between 1975 and 1985, those levels were 70 times higher than the EPA's allowable limits. Turns out soldiers and their families that drank the water were 70% more likely to develop Parkinson's than soldiers at other camps around the country with uncontaminated water. TCE is regularly used in processes like dry cleaning and office products. It is also used in refrigerants and as a degreaser. Its manufacture has been increasing in recent years. This study supports others that have been suggested a link and laboratory experiments that showed TCE caused the same kind of brain damage in rats that is found in human victims of Parkinson's. The contaminated water at Camp Lejeune has also been linked to a number of cancers and aplastic anemia. Moving on to the next news, Somalia underwater. Somalia has been experiencing its worst drought in 4 decades. However, in early May, it had a catastrophic rainstorm that caused the Shabelle River to burst its bank. About 250,000 people were forced to evacuate. Survivors talked about water rising to neck level in a matter of minutes.
Ooh, ouch.
Yep,
Scary.
that's really scary. Unfortunately, this rainfall event is not expected to break the drought. Last year, 43,000 excess deaths were attributed to the drought, half of them young children. Once the flood waters pass, the parched land is not expected to have absorbed enough water to break the cycle of dryness. Moving on to the next news. Ohio targeted for new nuclear plants. The corporation Oklo famously submitted a plan to the NRC for a small modular reactor (SMR) that was rejected because it did not give enough detail to actually evaluate if the reactor would work or not. It has resubmitted another plan that has not yet been approved, but that hasn't stopped the company from marketing its nuclear power plants as if they actually exist. On May 18, Oklo announced that it plans to build 2 nuclear plants in Piketon, Ohio. Piketon is a town already suffering from nuclear contamination from decades of nuclear industry. The Portsmouth gaseous diffusion plant ran from 1954 to 2001, enriching uranium for atomic weapons and nuclear power plants. This resulted in massive contamination of the area. Recently, that contamination forced the abandonment of elementary school 5 miles away from the plant. The federal government has embarked embarked a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar cleanup for the Portsmouth nuclear facilities in Piketon. But before that is even completed, Oklo wants to dump fresh sources of radiation on the site. Claiming a supportive and trained nuclear workforce in Piketon, Oklo wants to build two, not one, but two 15 megawatt nuclear plants. The Department of Energy has already transferred 300 acres of the Portsmouth site to Oklo, and is expected to give the company almost $20 million to get the process started. These would be sodium-cooled reactors. Critics have pointed out that Oklo's nuclear plant designs, in addition to being untested and experimental, are inherently unsafe since liquid sodium, when exposed to the air, catches fire and explodes.
That sounds very bad.
Very risky. Moving on to the next news, Supreme Court declares wetlands don't contain water. On May 25th, in a decision that has been described by environmental groups as catastrophic, the US Supreme Court, in a 5-4 decision, has said that wetlands don't contain water and therefore don't need environmental protection. Specifically, what is at stake here is Clean Water Act. That law, passed back in 1970, has the purpose of protecting the waters of the United States. For over 50 years, that has been interpreted as meaning wetlands and small streams. Since those sources of water feed the larger rivers and lakes, if the wetlands and streams are polluted, the rivers and lakes would also inevitably be polluted as well. However, the corporations such as real estate developers and chemical industries that would make more profit by filling in wetlands and dumping wastes into small streams have long argued that only bodies of water that are navigable, that is, big enough to float a boat, are actually water. All that other wet stuff in wetlands and small streams is apparently something else. Over the past 50 years, this idea has been brought before federal courts, both at the appellate and Supreme Court levels. In dozens of decisions prior to this, courts have also agreed that water in wetlands and water in rivers and lakes are interconnected. So, on May 25th, the Supreme Court decided to try its hand at redefining reality and declared only navigable water is in fact water.
I don't want no oil, a spoil in my shoreline. I like fish much better than crud. I like birds and things a-creeping and crawling. Won't trade no more oil for blood. The sun done give us all we need to make this country run. But that black demon oil's got us fussing and fighting, and I do believe it's time we was done. I don't want them nukes run by them kooks who think radioactivity is fun. No more three-headed frogs or kids with leukemia. Nuclear power ain't fit for a dog. The sun